So in the next hour and a half, we will reflect on our shared values around housing in Northeast LA and turn those values into housing solutions as a community together. And as you can see right here, this is going to be kind of the framework and the outline of today's workshop. And if you have any questions, you can always feel free to put them in the chat. So ways that we will engage this afternoon, since we'll be spending a lot of time together in conversations today, we hope that we can all engage in a respectful way as a community. So let's practice. First, we want to use I statements. So that means speak from your own experience. Second, try it on. So we all have our own biases. So we want to be willing to kind of try on new ideas and be willing to be kind of surprised and learn something new. Third, observe confidentiality. So we hope to create a space today where folks can feel safe and comfortable sharing with their neighbors. Fourth, we want to make space and take space. So what this means is take note of who's speaking and who's also not. If you tend to speak a lot, try to make some space for others and vice versa. And then lastly, right to pass. So you can pass on responding if you don't wish to speak. That is up to how you feel today. Great. So next, so who is LA Moss? So LA Moss, so we're a community organization based in Elysian Valley, AKA Frogtown. Our focus is on promoting housing affordability and economic resilience for working class communities of color in Northeast LA. To do this effectively, we believe that there needs to, it needs to be driven by our community. So our work prioritizes community ownership, leadership, and partnership with neighbors just like you. So what are housing here workshops? So today's workshop is a second of a three-part series in support of residents in defining housing policy, shaping housing solutions, and becoming housing advocates. So we're hosting two other workshops. One is focused on understanding community-led housing strategies, while the other explores ways to be a housing advocate. So our first round of workshops will be held online. However, we welcome anyone to join us for our in-person series, and that's starting July 20th. So that's next week on Thursday. Lastly, we want to thank you to all of our funding partners. So Southern California Association of Governments, LISC LA, Wells Fargo Foundation, California Community Foundation, and HMC Foundation for making this series possible. And so housing system creates the environment around us. So in our first workshop, we shared how housing policy and development gets shaped in LA and provided some examples of community-led housing strategies. If you're interested in learning more about this, join us for our in-person workshop next Thursday or check out the recording. We'll be sending this out and sharing it with everyone via email, and it also will be provided on our website. For our workshop today, our main focus is on how we can incorporate our community's voice in the housing process and how that can help change the housing system to better support our community. I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague Linda so we can get started.
So we wanted to set the stage today by first providing some historical context of housing and development in Northeast LA. So there are some major events and city planning decisions that have impacted who lives here and what resources are available for our community. Great. So, and these are some events that I think if you're local to the area, you might be familiar with. So I want to start off by sharing in the 1950s, so first is Chavez Ravine. So before Dodger Stadium was built in the early 1960s, the area was known as Chavez Ravine and was um, home to many Mexican American families who had faced housing discrimination in other parts of LA and who had established like 3 neighborhoods there. And in the 1950s, there was a decade-long battle over that land. First, to redevelop the land for public housing, with residents being bought out by developers or city officials seizing the land. And later, part of that battle evolved into the city approving a transfer of the land for Dodger Stadium as the team moved to LA during that time, instead of using the land for building public housing. And then in 1959, after much resistance by families who had been there for generations, there were forced evictions to clear out the area. And that's right around the corner from Northeast LA, and this led to many working class families being displaced and moving into what's now Northeast LA. And around the same time, the 5 freeway was built, and more investment was spent developing suburbs on the outskirts of LA. So, for example, nearby Lakewood and like Southeast LA was marketed as the first modern city with garbage disposals in every sink, with 50 homes starting construction every day during that time. And so meanwhile, while there was more investment in like developing those areas, there was less public investment in housing and community amenities in neighborhoods in Northeast LA. And this trend toward the suburbs or moving toward the suburbs continued um, in many parts of LA, and this mass exodus of especially white residents moving to newly developed neighborhoods was also known as white flight. And during the 80s and 90s, we saw more Latinx and Asian immigrant households beginning to settle into Northeast LA. And then in like from the 1970s to the 1990s, there was an emergence of more artists and neighborhood activists, who emerged in the wake of white flight. So these folks led a lot of like neighborhood revitalization efforts in response, I think, to a lot of public disinvestment of the region. So they spent time beautifying public spaces, starting arts programs, and trying to push for community input in local land use planning. They also helped promote a regional identity through some of the cultural events, like helping to bridge cultural divides between longtime and newer residents. And while this provided some public benefits to the neighborhoods, it also meant that the once disinvested region of Northeast LA was now this cultural arts hub that became more attractive to outside investors and new residents, and made it ripe for a lot of like neighborhood change. Um, and fast forward to today with investments in the LA River, from new bridges to new parks, as well as a focus on just the actual environmental restoration of the river and the wildlife around it. New businesses have moved in and property values have significantly increased, leading some residents to ask who these revitalization efforts are really for. And also today, we see a growing housing crisis that has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. We see long-term residents who are facing increasingly unaffordable rents, and increased property values of homes. We're also seeing more displacement and houselessness pressures. And so compared to 5 years ago when homes averaged 400 to 500,000, they're now selling for an average of 1 million in the region. And yeah, many of these events, which I think a lot of you were here in our first workshop, but many of these events, as you know, happened as a result of decisions made by a few interests in the government and private sectors. But today is about acknowledging that we as a community have power to define these solutions to the housing crisis and really shape the futures of our neighborhood. So today we'll spend our time to collectively imagine what that can look like in Northeast LA. So we invite you all to share the values and vision that you have for your community, and you'll have space to learn from your neighbors as well. We want to get ready for all of you to share your housing values and what you would like to see just with one another. So today's conversations will directly shape LA Moss's housing priorities in Northeast LA. And we also hope to continue to collaborate with all of you after today to advocate for this collective housing vision and to really turn the ideas that surface today into tangible community-led housing initiatives. So I think we're gonna begin by breaking into groups of 2, I believe, and to discuss these three questions. So 1, what does home mean to you? 2, how would you describe your experience with housing? So this can be your experience as a renter. Has your housing situation been pretty stable? And maybe what are some of the changes or circumstances you've experienced over the years? And then lastly, how do you see your housing needs? What do you anticipate changing in the next 5 to 10 years? And yeah, at the end of today's session, we'll have a chance to actually talk more about solutions. So this is really kind of just sharing your experiences with whatever you feel comfortable sharing. Each breakout group will have at least one LA Moss staff member who will reshare these questions in the chat so that you can reference them during your conversation. And after about 10 to 15 minutes in the breakout rooms, we'll invite one person from each group to share just some of the high-level themes that they heard. Cool. So welcome back, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed connecting and sharing with your neighbors. So we're just going to do a quick share out before we get to the next section. Does someone from Lily's group want to kick us off by sharing some highlights, just high-level highlights from their conversation? And before we share, I do want to remind folks to please observe confidentiality. So I ask that you share themes without identifying individuals unless you personally want to share part of your own story. So Lily, did you guys identify someone from your group to report back?
We did not. I can report back. Yeah, so it was very nice to hear everyone's experiences. And I think it's good to point out that everyone in our group had very different housing experiences. But yeah, there was conversations around home ownership and that not really being an option for some folks. And which I think, like I mentioned earlier, it's very disheartening to know. We had conversations on how the rent is super high in LA. Owning a home is nearly impossible. There's obviously a lot of housing issues in LA and just a big homeless issue that we all know is here. And there was also a lot of conversation about privileges and everyone being privileged in some way, but also kind of being that person to bridge housing issues and call on our privileges and be able to support others and be advocates for other people. And let's see. Yeah, and I think everyone pretty much shared how maybe in the next 5 to 10 years their housing is going to have to change in some way. I think one very big issue is space and just having enough space for people to live in, have an office and work and raising a family. Yeah, so does anybody have anything to add from our group?
Great, thanks, Lily. Does someone from Andrea's group want to share?
Yeah, I can share out. So I guess I'll just go through kind of the questions. I think some of the main themes that we pulled out were security. What having a home means is safety, where you can feel safe raising a family and be able to make plans for your future. And this idea of more of a collective than individualistic really kind of came out not just in the meaning of home, but also what we want to see in the next 5 to 10 years is having the neighborhood collectively be able to own property instead of individual families. And so it builds more on community. And even though kind of what Lily was saying, each story was very different and rich. And each person might be at a different socioeconomic status, doesn't mean that each person faces difficulties when wanting to purchase a home or a property. And then one thing that got brought up was, even if we do have the resources and the funding to purchase a house, say in Elysian Valley, do you have to be mindful of, are you going to continue to push gentrification and displacement by purchasing property within that location and being culturally aware of who's living there and what your impact is going to be? And I think lastly, we also talked about this idea of putting in the work of you might be a homeowner, say, but everyone else might be struggling with rent, but you showing up for your neighbors and you being there as an advocate and you making sure that everyone, we all agreed that we want everyone to have a safe, secure home. But how do we get there, and how we get there is together. And so those were some of the big kind of overarching themes that we shared and spoke about within our group. And I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything. Great. Okay. Thank you. And thank you to everyone who shared. It was a wonderful talk.
Great, thank you, Andrea. And I think the last group is the group I was part of. So some of the themes that came up during our conversation were, one was like this idea of home being associated with wherever our family or community is. Another is just having ties to our family or parents' homes, whether that's the physical house or the neighborhood or the country. Another, as many shared, is just not being able to afford to even rent or purchase and having to look elsewhere, like outside of maybe the neighborhoods we would want to stay in. And I think something that Andrea mentioned from her group, I think also came up in ours in terms of like finding affordable housing, but that possibly finding affordable housing maybe in another neighborhood, but that possibly leading to gentrification in other communities, and the kind of tension between that. And then I think lastly, I think we all had like personal connections to why we do housing related work. So that was cool to share with those folks. Great, well, thanks everyone. And as I mentioned, we do want to do some collective visioning around what some housing solutions can look like based on these values. But before that, I'm going to pass it back to Andrea to share what the broad categories of housing solutions can look like or currently look like, so that yeah, when we get to the visioning piece, folks have some ideas of where we can go with that.
So how can homes stay affordable? So it's clear that one of the recurring themes in our housing values is the idea that housing should be affordable. So we're going to just go over a few examples of what affordable housing looks like. So first, naturally occurring affordable housing. So what you see here is an older residential rental property built before 1978. These properties are protected by our rent stabilization ordinance, making their units more affordable compared to the current housing market. Next is government subsidized affordable housing. So these housing units usually have some type of government funding and have a legal obligation to be rented affordably. This is often for 55 years. And the Taylor Yards Transit Village over in Cypress Park on San Fernando Road is an example with buildings dedicated to serving seniors and families. So affordable in these projects are based on our region's average median income, which is almost $80,000 for a family of one. So for the Taylor Yards family building called Parque Vista, families are eligible if they earn between 30 and 60% of the average median income. So if you earn less than 40,000 as a single person, your AMI, area median income, is at 50%, and you can apply. Next up is public housing. So throughout LA, government agencies once built housing called public housing, where all the residents are income qualified, earning below the poverty line. So receiving housing vouchers. These units are not being built today, with the closest one being in William Mead Homes, which is a 400+ unit complex near Chinatown. And then lastly are Section 8 properties. So any landlord can choose to serve as a Section 8 property owner, accepting as their tenant someone who has a Section 8 voucher. That is a government subsidy to income qualified individuals so that they pay only a third of their income, with the government paying the rest. So our backyard homes project has about 5 homeowners who are building new Section 8 units. And okay, so now that we've covered some examples of affordable housing, we also want to look at, we want to provide a high-level overview of ways that housing can be built in our communities. So first, we're going to talk about new developments. One is big mid-rise apartments. So what you're looking at right now is a 49-unit complex down the street from the Mercadito in Elysian Valley, and it was permitted a few years ago. Based on zoning incentives, the property is able to build more units if a percentage of units are affordably rentable. So there will be about 3 units that will be affordably rented for 55 years. And then next is the small lots subdivision. So these homes look like apartment complexes, as you can tell in the photos right here, but are built a little bit different because they can be purchased. So made possible by the small lot subdivision, which is a policy of, I think in 2005, these homes tend to be 2 to 3 stories on a small footprint of single family residential land. So next, we're going to be talking about adapting existing housing. So accessory dwelling units, those are also known as ADUs, backyard homes, in-law units. They may seem like they are popping up kind of everywhere as new construction is happening. However, the majority of these ADUs in the city are additions to an existing home, or conversions like a garage. And then multi-generational housing. So many of our neighbors have creatively created space for more family members to live in a single family home, like turning a closet or a living room into a bedroom. And then next, preserving existing housings. So we're going to first talk about acquisitions. So the Fidocomisión, sorry, I can't pronounce that correctly. Tierra Libre's Community Land Trust took property off the speculative market by purchasing an 11-unit multifamily apartment complex in East LA. They did this in partnership with an established community development corporation, which is called Little Tokyo Services Center. Next, we're going to talk about advocacy. So the Keep LA House coalition of tenants, activists, and community-based organizations has been pushing for policies such as full rent relief and eviction prevention programs, with victories like having tenants being protected from evictions until the end of September.
Thanks, Andrea. So yeah, those are just some of the broad categories of different solutions that exist. But I think most of you joined our previous workshop too. There's other like creative community-led solutions as well. So now we want to move into our collective exercise to just like, I guess, crowdsource what are some solutions you want to see in Northeast LA in your neighborhood. So for example, this can be maybe you want to see more multifamily housing or more housing that's suited for larger multi-generational families. Maybe you see that there's a need for more affordable senior housing, etc. And so we're going to share this, or Helen just shared a Jamboard in the chat, and Ronnie, I'm hoping you can share it as well. Okay, great. So this is a Jamboard. It's just a tool we can use for folks to just interact like live. So if you want to add your own notes to this document, you can. Cool. Awesome. And if anything comes up more, like just feel free to continue adding to the Jamboard. We'll share this all with folks after the workshops. Great. So we're just going to share a few examples that are either in Northeast LA or near Northeast LA that I think touch on some of the themes that came up. So I know in our first workshop, if you were present, we talked about community land trust, and this also came up as a solution today. But the LA Eco Village is an intentional community in Koreatown. It's managed by residents and community members, and in Koreatown, there's like 2 blocks that of affordable housing units that are managed by the Eco Village, where residents practice democratic decision making and sustainable living, and tenants, there are tenant and like owner, like stakeholder members that actually control or like, yeah, shape the decisions of how the property is managed and like what happens in the space, in the shared space. And this is like the housing property itself is, the housing cooperative itself is managed by a group, I'm blanking on the name, the acronym is us2, but the land itself is owned and was acquired by Beverly Vermont Community Land Trust. So it's an example of housing that's stewarded by residents and is permanently affordable. And another example that's a mix of both preserving affordable housing as well as building new development is Roland Curtis Gardens in South LA. This is a bit more recent than LA Eco Village, which is almost around like 30 years old by now. But Roland Curtis, this was a new housing development that was made possible because renters fought a 15-month campaign resisting evictions by a new property owner of their apartment building. And so Trust South LA, which is another local community land trust, purchased the property and did build a new development with 138 units, but they preserved 48 of those units for the previous tenants. And so, yeah, it was designed for multicultural working class families and as well as having space for small businesses as well. Another example that's closer to Northeast LA is Hilsabia. which is in Chinatown, and there is currently a fight to keep 59 units of housing affordable for senior residents who are currently living there. And this property was required to remain affordable for 30 years, but that agreement with the city expired in 2018. But because of advocacy from grassroots organizers and tenants, the city is now exploring how to force a sale from the property owners to the city to be able to preserve these units. And then I think this is our last example. Another one in Northeast LA in Lincoln Heights. There is Camino al Oro, which has 102 units of affordable housing for seniors. This was built in 2005, and it's within walking distance of the Metro Gold Line and was part of the Avenue 26 Master Development Plan that includes both affordable rentals as well as affordable and market rate condos. And this was developed by a local community development organization, Works. And I think that was it. So, I mean, hopefully these give you some ideas of like what some other community organizers and different organizations such as Land Trust have been able to like push for to either build, preserve, or adapt existing affordable housing. And now I'm going to pass it to Andrea to wrap us up.
Thank you, Linda. So today we covered a lot. We covered how our city's housing solutions can better reflect our community values. Community members like you have the power to really influence what type of housing is developed. And, you might know people who are struggling to keep their home, who can't afford their rent, who possibly hope that one day they can be able to buy a home or to stay in their own community. So we just hope to continue this conversation with Northeast LA residents, like all of you, beyond this workshop. And so some of our next steps that we'd like to go over is to just share this information and the workshop series with your neighbors. Also to stay tuned for more workshops, focused specifically on the city's housing element and how to make sure its policies get implemented. And lastly, we're also looking to build a housing program that reflects the values that you all have expressed to us today. We'll follow up with more resources and ways to get involved later this summer. Yeah. And then we have one more workshop left in our online series, and this will be next week on Tuesday. So please join us to learn different ways to advocate for equitable housing. We'll be repeating the 3-part series once more in person starting next week on Thursday. And Helen will also share a link in the chat with everyone so they have access. And then last, we just want to thank you all for joining us today.